Shabbat Shalom. One of the Parshiot we read this week is Kedoshim, which begins with this phrase, Kedoshim Tiyu, which has been subject to many interpretations. And I'd like to take a look at them by focusing on their parsing of the phrase Kedoshim Tiyu and the status of the verb Tiyu. As we'll see, Tiyu is ambiguous in a way. It can be interpreted as an imperative or as an imperfective or as a future, sort of absolute future. And these leads to different meanings given to the verse. The most common and the earliest reading that I know of is reading it as a imperative. Be holy. This is how the Torah Kohanim, the Tanaic Midrash, reads it, but also interpreting it to mean prushim tiyu. Prushim meaning lefrosh min arayot, to be sexually abstemious, and this is to connect, as the Midrash often does, this parsha to the preceding one. The last part of Parshat Achrei has the Parshat Arayot, which you read every Yom Kippur at Mincha, and so it's sort of natural to see that the following parsha begin with the command Kedoshim Tiyu along the same vein. And Rashi adopts this interpretation, and Rashi even rephrases it, Kedoshim Havu, to make it clear that he's reading it as an imperative, because Havu is certainly an imperative. If it's an imperative, then maybe or it should be a mitzvah. And then we come to the question, should it be counted among the 613 commandments as we traditionally count them? And here we arrive at a very famous machloket, a very famous difference of opinion between the Ramban and the Ramban, between Maimonides and Nachmanides. The Rambam, Maimonides, in the introduction to his Sefer Mitzvot, lays out 14 general rules that he uses in order to classify the commandments and decide which to count as mitzvot and which not. And one of the rules he lays out is that very, sweeping commandments that just basically tell us to observe the whole Torah, should not be counted as separate commandments. And in this list of these sweeping commandments, he includes Kedoshim Tiyu as simply a general, exhortation to observe the whole Torah. But the Ramban disagrees. He sees Kedoshim Tiyu as a separate, distinct mitzvah with much wider applications than what Rashi said. It means to be abstemious, to restrain ourselves, not to overindulge in all matters, particularly those concerned with our body, eating, drinking, and so on. And here he has his famous phrase of Naval B'Shut Torah, that ostensibly someone can, gorge himself, and as long as he's eating kosher food with Badat's approval, and get drunk on kosher wine, then he hasn't violated any biblical precept. But that's not true. There is another precept, Kedoshim Tiyu, which tells us in general, in all matters, to put limits. I would even say severe limits on what we do. And it's interesting that the Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik, in his the book that came out posthumously, the Rabbi Soloveitchik on the Torah, the Rav on the Parsha, has a way of reading Kedoshim Tiyu which more or less harmonizes Rambam and Ramban. It's interesting because in his shiurim on Sefer Mitzvot, I had the privilege and honor to attend some of them in Boston decades ago, and some of them that he gave in New York, and which were much more fuller, are available on the web. There, the main point of these shiurim was to point to what the Rav would call the great creative interpretation of the Ramban and his tremendous Kedoshim that he shows in his critique of the Rambam. But here, in his commentary on the verse, he harmonizes them and says that Kedoshim Tiyu means that we should integrate all the commandments into a holy lifestyle. In other words, we shouldn't the commandments of the Torah should not be viewed as just a set of discrete rules. Do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. Without any sort of overarching directive. Instead, Kedoshim Tiyu tells us that we should integrate all of the mitzvot of the Torah into a wholesome and holy lifestyle. Another interpretation in this vein, which I'm not quite sure how to understand, is in Chemdat Yamim, the Perush written by Rab Shalom Shabazi, Rab Omari Salam Shabazi, from Yemen in the 16th century, but based on other earlier Yemenite commentaries, which he calls the Kedoshim Tiyu Lashon Kolel. Apparently, he's making something of the fact that it's in the plural, Kedoshim Tiyu, even though it's a commandment that's aimed at the individual. It uses the plural form, Kedoshim Tiyu, which is not unusual, but still there's room, to make a drush of this, and he takes it to mean that we should be holy in both the spiritual and the practical side of things. Kol ha'ma'asim v'kol ha'machshavot, all our actions and all our thoughts should be holy. So far, so much for those who see Kedoshim Tiyu as an imperative. The Or HaChaim, Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar, sees it as an imperfective, and he actually, his grammatical explanation is I think stunning in that it's really exactly, I think, how as far as I know, the modern grammarian would interpret Kedoshim Tiyu, because he says Tiyu, Ein hefsek lemitzvah zu, it's an unending mitzvah. Now, we tend to impose our, Western grammatical concepts and structures on the Semitic languages, even if we know the grammar. But in fact, in certainly in ancient Semitic languages, in the biblical Hebrew, we don't really have so much tenses as we have modes. There's a perfective mode in which the verb indicates a completed action, and there's an imperfective mode which indicates an incomplete or uncompleted action. Now, some mitzvot are completed. When, on the light of the Seder, once we swallow a kazayit of matzah, that's it. We have totally fulfilled what we've been asked to do, and there's nothing more asked of us. And even mitzvot that we do repeatedly, such as, praying or making kiddush on Shabbat, or putting on tefillin, or Parshat Chala, each action, once it's completed, that's it. We're totally relieved of the obligation until the next time the mitzvah presents itself. But that's not the case with Kedoshim Tiyu. There's never a point in life where someone can say, I'm kadosh, I am holy, I have completely fulfilled the mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that never ends. And I think we should all be aware of this. Those of us who consider ourselves to have a long way to go, and those of us, if there are some, and perhaps there are some, who think they have already arrived at the ultimate in Kedusha. There's no such thing. It's an unending mitzvah. Finally, there's an insight, a Hasidic insight. I saw it, I heard it on a YouTube video by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Alav Shalom, but I found it also in an earlier Hasidic book by one of the Admorim, one of the Rebbeim from the Alexander Hasidim, which takes it as a future, not an imperfective, a future and a promise, a havtacha. You will be holy. The Rebbe said this in a drush, in a speech, or whatever you want to call it, that he gave to children. The Rebbe had an incredible insight into children. People probably would say, well, he thinks children are gullible and they'll, believe whatever he says, and that's why he spoke to them. But that's not true. The Rebbe did not speak down to children. He spoke up to children because he realized that children have a certain openness and willingness to listen and ability to adapt and change themselves, which adults lack. Adults, of course, parents, other adults, are always chanting these slogans of, openness and inclusivity and real change and blah, 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 blah. But when you see how they act, they're just they're stuck in the same rut that they've been for years. But children are not that way. Children can listen, absorb, and put into practice. And the Rebbe knew this, and he spoke up to them. He spoke to them on as high a level as he'd speak to adults. And the Rebbe said, Kedoshim to you, it's a promise, a guarantee from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that through the instrument of Hashgacha, you will be holy. So with this encouraging thought, I'll leave you with wishes for Shabbat Shalom, Gula Shlema, Krova B'Yameinu, Amen.